Director of Active Transportation Alliance. And I'm really excited to be doing a deep dive on the brand new, hot off the presses, Metropolitan Mobility Act. And I will go through an overview of the act. It's hundreds of pages long. So I will not do it justice today, but hopefully you'll get the spirit of things to understand better one of the proposed solutions to transform transit in the northeastern Illinois region of Illinois. So some quick background. Transit is vital. We all have different reasons why we need it and why we love it. At a very high level, when we're talking about state policy to transform transit, some of the reasons that the state should be leaning in ambitiously into supporting transit include that it is one of our most equitable ways of getting around. It is affordable, and at least in Chicago, is quite widespread and deeply meaningful to community vitality. In addition, it is very powerful economically. The Chicago region is about 75% or more of the state's economic gross domestic product, our revenue, and companies move here and companies stay here because of quality life elements where transit is really squarely a part of the decision making. It is very important for getting younger workers attracted to those businesses, as well as getting workers just coming to work. And then last, but certainly not least, is the environment. We are living in a week of over 90 degree temperatures in June. And the effects of climate change certainly cannot be ignored. And the drivers of the changes in the climate that relate to greenhouse gas emissions, transportation is culpable. It, like, point the finger right at it. It is one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in our state. So there are a lot of reasons why transit solves pressing problems for the state and for ourselves personally. Despite that, our region's transit system is mired in significant overlapping challenges that require urgent action and transformative action. So I'll very briefly touch on these. The first is service delivery, the second is funding sustainability, and the third is governance and structure of the system. As it relates to services, as I was telling someone recently, if I had kept a journal of my transit trips just in 2024, it would be a book that people would buy if they really liked very dramatic, upsetting stories of things that you're like, are they really going to do that? Are they really going to get on the train again? Things are not going well. And it's not equally bad across the system, but it's bad in a way that I certainly, as someone who's been riding it for 40 years, has never experienced. In addition to just general conditions, the levels of service have fallen considerably. We have obviously heard a lot of complaints in these last few years about transit, but the reductions in service have been happening for a long time. And you can see in that light blue CTA bus line that we have lost almost 30% of service on buses. And that is where the majority of riders are. In our recovery from COVID, service drops has been far behind that of peer systems. So you can see that none of the agencies and services have caught up to their peers in recovering from the loss of riders. I did meet with RTA yesterday, and they said the new data on this is really, really strong and promising. And that will actually help make the case for some of what we're fighting for. If there are better data showing that people are back and want transit. Data is just one piece of the puzzle, but it's an important one. Secondly, transit's been underfunded for decades. So there's a lot of talk about the looming fiscal cliff, which is more like a waterfall of deepening gap in funding for operations. It has been a long time coming, and it's just been sped up by the pandemic. You can see in this chart that Illinois provides a very small share of transit operations funding relative to peer cities and states around the country. So we want to be much more like New York, Boston, Philadelphia in having adequate state resources undergirding our system so expensive, so we can be innovative and so we can meet demand. It's really important that the state play a role in this because the federal government does not fund transit operations. We have been working on congressional legislation to get them to fund operations, but that is not going to happen anytime soon. But we'll continue laying the groundwork for that because we need everybody to have a stake in the game in something so important to our mobility future. And then finally, on the problem side, our outdated structure is preventing us from delivering the system we want. Our current structure is 40 years old. It was created during a fiscal crisis, and it was created at a time of political unrest as it related to Harold Washington becoming mayor of Chicago and the state legislature being not just Republican dominated, but suburban dominated. And that really led the decision-making around how the system was created. The legislature at the time did not want to give Chicago any more power than they needed to. And it relates and then flows into a bunch of different problems. The funding formula for who gets what is fixed, and it's not responsive to new and evolving needs and demands. The incentives are really unfortunate. PACE and Metro and CTA are competing for money versus collaborating on projects. And the RTA, who's supposed to make them all work together beautifully, doesn't have all the authority it needs and doesn't feel like it could tell the agencies what to do. And on I could go. So that's what we're faced with. And so we've been involved in a process through our advocacy at Active Transportation Alliance for many years, probably a decade or more, on figuring out how can we transform transit? What do we need? And we've been releasing research and doing public input and organizing around fare policy, around buses, making great buses, around the red line extension and other things. On top of that, the legislature passed a law a couple of years ago directing CMAP to create a report to give to the legislature on how to transform transit in Chicago. So I helped lead the system we want work. And there was another team that worked on that structure of the system and another team that worked on funding. And through the course of that work and all the people involved, there were something like 17 work and research and meetings and community input that went into creating the plan of action for regional transit. So we through that report and through our work identified, let's just make the system great. And it's not rocket science. We want exceptional service, a universally accessible system. We want our rides to be safe and comfortable, our fares to be integrated across systems, and we want destinations to be within reach, key destinations within reach. So you can see under what I just read, there's a lot of detail on what does that mean in terms of public policy or practice. And there are some things that are lacking in how the current RTA Act is structured that prevent some of this from happening. So we took this, we modeled what it's going to cost to get to the system we want and determined that our transit agencies together need about $1.5 billion additional annually from the state, plus policy change to get us where we want to go. So we worked on legislation with a lot of people, including the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, to get to a proposal that we're calling a discussion draft of what transformative legislation could look like. And it's currently called the Metropolitan Mobility Authority Act. As I said, it's hundreds of pages, so we're not going to talk about all of it. This is a quick snapshot. It creates a unified system. I'll talk about that in a minute. It changes board appointments. Currently, each transit agency, PACE, Metra, CTA, and RTA, all have different boards with different requirements. Some of the requirements are geographic, some relate to who can appoint the board member, but very few of the requirements include things like transit agency expertise and other things.
Oh, I moved these at some point when I was.
So there's reform of that. It's much more rider-centered. So there's a new Citizens Advisory Board being proposed that has a seat on the overall board. It encourages metrics for service that are based on rider needs versus what's happening today, which is based on these fixed formulas and the fare box recovery, which is how much money can they get from that service. There's a lot of improvements in here on fare policy, including a unified fare structure, a streamlined, easy to understand and use low-income fare program, and fare capping, which means if at the beginning of the month, a person cannot afford a monthly pass, but needs to take transit a lot, and we know the monthly pass is ultimately going to be more affordable, they pay one ride at a time as they get paid. And once they have spent the money that it would cost to buy that pass in the first place, that venture card turns into a monthly pass and they don't have to pay anything else. So it's recognizing the fact that lower income workers don't have the stability of income at the beginning of the month always to shell out for a pass. The legislation proposes eliminating the fare box recovery ratio. And this is currently in the law stating that the transit agencies have to recover at least half of their operating funding from fares. And nowhere else in the country has a fare box recovery ratio like that. And it's ended up being really punitive to people who live on less busy bus lines, but that doesn't mean they're not important bus lines for a whole host of reasons. And so during COVID, one of the things that happened with PACE, for example, is they cut all their routes to metro stations because metro use dropped so much, and those have not ever returned. So you can't really take a bus easily to a metro station because of the determination that it's not going to bring in enough fares. Really importantly, and really important to the theory of change to how transit is most effective, is number 6, which is land use and creating incentives for transit-oriented development, so that when we're putting a lot of money into deals around development, making sure that it is transit-oriented in a host of different ways. And this is obviously legislation that we've worked on in the city for years and have made a lot of progress on, but this doesn't exist outside of the city. Number 7, DOT collaboration. So the majority of our transit operates on state roadways. When we want to do something like bus rapid transit, it is most often going to happen best on a state operated roadway. But the State Department of Transportation, while it has responsibility related to transit, it is so ancillary. And our current local office of the Department of Transportation that approves project designs and other things doesn't have a transit unit. So through this legislation, we are establishing units in the local office and in other ways so that roadway design for transit is embedded into the Department of Transportation. I'll stop talking soon, I promise. Number 8, safety. So the current approach to safety from the lens of CTA was to hire through a very, very, very expensive security contract security guards that don't really do much. And I could, again, in my little journal of just this year alone, could give you many examples of how they're not doing much. We have been advocating for many years the creation of a transit ambassador program that is something that happens in a few other cities and has been slowly growing, that would bring more skilled people in to help address the mental health, the substance use, homelessness, as well as just general wayfinding and other issues that people encounter on transit. It's a more skilled approach that has been proven really effective and makes the system much more welcoming. I will not talk too much about rights and accountability, but I will say a big part of this from the lens of the legislature is having a more accountable system and creating mechanisms for reporting and intervention when things aren't going well, versus what we have today, which is hearings and other things that ultimately don't result in a lot of change. So I'm going to zoom into a couple of these. Let me check the time. Okay, yeah, I'll have a few minutes. I'm going to zoom into a couple of these a little more closely. So the unified system, what does that mean? It means that instead of having MetroPace, CTA, and RTA, we would have one agency, the Metropolitan Mobility Authority. It would be responsible for fare policy, for capital planning. So for example, CTA and PACE have bus electrification plans that they're slowly rolling out and seeking funding for, but they are doing it without coordinating. So CTA and PACE will be building charging centers for their buses with that they can't share with each other. And that's just ridiculous. Given that many CTA buses end at the city lines and PACE buses start just outside, they could be sharing charging centers right along those lines, for example. Service planning is not coordinated. And so you see this in a whole host of different ways. Like I mentioned, cutting PACE bus routes to Metra because they don't plan together on many things. We've seen it with CTA bus routes and PACE bus routes. I was in a meeting about a year ago in the Austin neighborhood of Chicago, and a worker told me that what they did, like the gymnastics they did to get to work, which was outside the city, but not that far from home, because the bus ended right at the city line. The PACE bus wasn't on that same street and had such limited hours, and they worked the second shift. So they could get to work often on buses if they left home way, way, way early, but they could very rarely get home easily on buses, and we're taking Ubers and Lyfts, which are much more expensive. And that's because we're not coordinating the bus service and not thinking about where the job centers are and when they're operating in a way that we could be. The other thing I'll just say on this slide before I move on is that the transit operations, so like running a CTA train, running a CTA bus, running a PACE bus, doing paratransit, and running regional rail are all really different types of operations. So much of the infrastructure we have today to operate the system would remain in place because you can't collapse paratransit into regional rail. Radically different sets of rules and regulations to operate those, and really different operating. One is on demand, and one was really fixed schedules. So we need to maintain the uniqueness of what it takes to operate these systems while making them work as one. There's a transit ambassador program, there's the Citizens Advisory Board, and the DOT staff. In terms of next steps, there will be the next conversation to be had, which is a really important one, which is about revenue. How will we come up with an additional $1.5 billion to invest in this important system? We have been working through what principles are really important for thinking about that. The first one, which is kind of the obvious one, which is the state needs to provide more money. The state needs to be in the game, as its peer states are, in making sure we have a great system. The reduced fare programs in paratransit must have stable, dedicated funding. If the state alone next year said, we're going to fully fund those, it would go a long way to addressing the imminent financial pressures. These programs are mandated by law. We can't get rid of them. Some of them are state laws, some of them are federal laws, but no one who's mandated that these programs exist are funding them. And they're really, really important. Transportation revenues should fund transportation investments. We bring in a lot of money in transportation money, but we're not putting it into transit. So there's some opportunities there to think creatively. Funding should also deliver benefits for equity and climate goals. So if you think about funding sources, you can think about what funding mechanisms would actually encourage people to use transit. And that would help meet many goals, climate goals, funding goals, transit goals. And really, really importantly, the revenues must maintain their buying power over time. The last time we had a fiscal crisis where the state took action on funding for transit, some of the funding sources have not kept up with inflation and have in fact been so variable that you can't rely on them for operations planning. And when it comes to operations, we're talking about staff, we're talking about fuel, we're talking about signage and some other things. So it's really important that we have a stable source of revenue so we know how much service can be run. And when revenue's going all over the place, it's really hard. Through the process I mentioned earlier, through the Plan of Action for Regional Transit, a lot of revenue ideas have been thrown out there, but the legislature has not yet taken action on any of them. You don't have to read this slide. I know there's a lot on here, and this is just one of many tables backed up with hundreds of pages of briefs around what revenue should we be considering. I put this up here just to show a couple things. First, it will be a solution that has multiple sources of revenue. It's not going to be a one revenue solution. In other states who have been addressing their fiscal crisis, they have also done a two-step process where they've done an immediate action to meet a current need and kind of kicking the can down the road on the more meaningful revenue changes for transformational investment. So they're going to have to go back at it in 2 years. Revenue in Illinois is really, really hard. And doing that, saying, oh, we'll just do a little bit now and come back in 2 years when the crisis has become muted will be extra, extra hard here. And we can talk more about that. The one revenue source I'll zoom in on, and then we'll do some Q&A, is the sales tax. Right now, our transit operations are primarily funded by fares, and that will continue, and the sales tax. There is an RTA tax included within our sales tax on goods. So you probably today contributed to the RTA sales tax and something you purchased. Thank you for doing that. The problem is, and this is a problem across Illinois that we should have addressed a couple years ago and a couple years before that and a couple years before that, is our tax base in Illinois is largely a sales tax on goods, and our economy is no longer a goods economy. We are much more a service economy. We have gotten out of the manufacturing business. We're still in it, but not in the way that we were. And you can see there from 1959 until 2021, the green line is the decrease in consumption of goods by our households. And the blue line is the increased consumption of services. And we are not taxing services. So one of the core proposals being put forth to address the transit fiscal cliff is to have a body of services that are taxed, and those taxes go to transit. Depending on the decisions made around that, those taxes could also go to other things. But this is an important part of the discussion. This is not the first time adding a tax to services has happened in Illinois, but this is the first time where elected officials and even the governor seem to be more open to it. So that's kind of where we're at with that. In terms of what happens next. So this summer, the Senate Transportation Committee is planning a series of subject matter hearings throughout the region. They are trying to land on where and when. So I will roughly say there'll probably be about 5 to 7 hearings, a couple in Chicago and Cook County, and the rest in the other counties in the region, where the members of the legislature can learn more about different elements of this proposal, and members of the public can be weighing in. There is also a community engagement effort that we're a part of, where we're going out and collecting more feedback on these policies, other ideas, concerns being raised, so that when we go back into the legislative session in January, we can update the legislation based on a round of six more months of input. There may be, on top of all that, some county board town halls and other things. So we're waiting to hear back from that. So a lot of opportunities to be weighing in on this coming up soon. The legislature is most likely going to take this up next year. It is possible things could be addressed in veto session, which is at the end of the year, or in the lame duck session, which is in January before the new legislature is sworn in. But I would say, just from the meetings I have like every other day on this, it doesn't seem that likely. So I think we're looking at kind of a full legislative session of debate on this, with hopefully some resolution by next May. So I will stop there, and we can get some input and do some Q&A.
Hey, thanks so much, Amy. I'm gonna stop the recording here.